Cheerio, let's get started. So today we're going to be talking about the War of the Roses. In my mind, it's going to be like a Ratchet crash course because we have a $0 budget and no John Green. Okay, so we're going to begin with King Edward III. So King Edward III is the son of King Edward II and Princess Isabella from France. So they're the house of Plantagenets. Plantagenets. Edward II was a really ineffective ruler. He liked to fight with the barons of England, and they just didn't get along, which weakened England essentially, and the government and everything like that. So Isabella was just frustrated, so she randomly took a lover named Mortimer, and they plotted to overthrow him, get rid of him, and put Edward III on the throne, and then act as his regent, so that they would basically take over England, whatever. So that's what they did, and they locked Edward II in a tower where he was eventually murdered, so love that for him. But then, you know, Edward III got pretty mad because his mother essentially murdered his father after cheating on him. So what he decided to do was to basically lead this invasion into a tower or something like that that Mortimer and Bella were hanging out in, and so he surprise attacked them and ended up executing Mortimer and exiling Isabella to some other random tower, because that's where they imprison people apparently in England, was random towers. Anyways, so then sometime later on, Edward III tries to become King of Scotland, but then, I don't know, something just like fell through and that didn't happen, so he shifted his attention to France, because he tried to make a claim for the crown over there because Isabella was from France. Obviously, she was a princess. The king, obviously, was not a fan of this idea. So this launched a war between France and England that was called the 100 Years' War. Lasted for like roughly 100 years. Then, oh my God, then the Black Plague strikes in 1347, and that affects 30 to 50% of England. So this really just ruined the economy, and it killed a lot of people. And does this sound familiar? Edward, he was all fine though, you know, so he claimed 25% of France in exchange for dropping his claim to the crown. So he got 25% of France's territory lands. At the height of things, he became really well known for being extra, which is, you know, like well dressed and just going all out. So that, in conjunction with him starting a 100 Years' War and just basically doing whatever the who heck he wanted to do, he bankrupted England. That's fine. The Queen dies, and Edward gets this mistress named Alice, but everybody hated Alice because she was like scheming and they didn't trust her. And then Edward dies of a stroke in 1376. Alright, so after King Edward III dies of his stroke, King Richard II gets crowned at the age of 10. That's King Edward III's grandson. King Edward III bankrupted England, so when Richard basically came of age to start making decisions, he decided to heavily tax peasants. Is there like a better word for that? He decided to severely tax them. Peasants revolted. He kind of squashed this revolt. That was the end of the peasants' concerns. So then the French tried to invade England. Richard to flee to the Midlands, which is like, you know, I don't know, some other place in England. But while he was in the Midlands, he found powerful allies. They submitted a formal appeal against the allies that Richard had made in response to him gaining those allies, because I think they just wanted to take power away from him. So then the English court at some point was purged basically of all of Richard's non-supportive people, so you can see this is going in a really great direction. Once he got rid of everybody in the court that he didn't like, in Parliament that he didn't like, rolled back the taxes, which somehow gained him popularity, even though he's the one who started the whole mess. Richard becomes kind of narcissistic. So then he gained control over Ireland, and he used that to assert control over England, and he basically just became a narcissistic tyrant, and he got rid of everybody that he didn't like, that opposed him, and he put people in that did like him. So basically all of this was kind of like the last straw for Parliament, and like all the people that were left there that didn't support him. And there was a rebellion led by Richard's cousin Henry. So they basically just overthrew him, and they were just gonna like lock him away in a tower, but then they realized apparently he still had like supporters left, and there was a rebellion led by those supporters. So Henry IV was like, you know what, let's just nip it in the bud and execute him. So they executed Richard II. So then we move on to King Henry IV. Now, in order for this to make sense, we kind of have to back up from where we left off with King Richard. King Henry IV he comes from the Lancaster household. His father is John of Naught. So basically, John of Naught died, and that made Henry Duke of the Lancaster land. So that means that he was basically entitled to money, land, but then Richard, basically, when he was running out of money, he just stole from the Lancasters. He took the land, he took the money, and then he went another step further, and he just exiled Henry for like 10 years. That really, really, really pissed off Henry, as you could imagine. And so while Richard was in Ireland trying to gain the support of other people, he invaded England to look for supporters, basically, but that wasn't very hard because Richard was a tyrant and he was basically the worst. Henry overthrew, what was his name? They're all named the same thing. Henry overthrew Richard and had him executed. Henry is coronated, and everything is pretty fine for a while, but then there was some dude named Owain, and he just like randomly declared himself the Prince of Wales, which is like really rude, I guess. This was basically all a plot to basically steal the crown right out from under Henry's feet. Henry had it all under control. He basically just went into battle and killed a bunch of people and just stopped this nefarious plot. So meanwhile, King Henry's son, Prince Henry, they got some real original names. He led a battle to regain land, and this led him to become a favorite at royal court. This basically caused a lot of tension between him and his father because the court seemed to favor Prince Henry over the king. So then Henry IV, he ended up dying pretty early on of disease. He had a bunch of stroke. So now we move on to Henry V. Which number are we on now? He was known for kind of being a partier when he was younger. When he got older, he became more religious and believed more in order. And here's a little drama for you. Even after Richard stole from his family and exiled his father, he still decided to hang out at court with Richard. Remember the Owain dude who tried to say that he was the Prince of Wales? Yeah, so that really pissed off Henry V, because he was the firstborn son of the king. So he was like, bro, I'm gonna be king. What are you talking about? He was like, fight me. And so they fought. Henry V won. Big surprise there. And obviously, like I said, that won him favor at court. King Henry V becomes king, the king of France, King Charles. He was kind of losing his mind at this point. So there was a lot of anarchy going on. Henry took advantage of this and he invaded France. And then he was basically going to overthrow King Charles and get his throne, but they came to a sort of agreement where they were going to let the king die on the throne. Once the king died, then Henry V would be named King of France as well as King of England. Once this whole deal was reached, he got married to Catherine Valois, which was King Charles's daughter, which would give him like a stronger claim to the throne. Like 2 months before Charles died, Henry V, he died of dysentery, and this was like, I think, a little while before or a little while after his son, his only son, and the next king was born. He did all this work, and then he didn't reap any of the benefits. Isn't that a little sad? Shakespeare wrote a play about him, and then Netflix did a show about him. I don't know if the Netflix show is based on Shakespeare's play. I didn't look that in depth to it. He is regarded as one of England's greatest kings. All right, now we move on to King Henry VI. So King Henry VI, because his dad died of dysentery before he was born, he was king when he was less than a year old, which is pretty young if you ask me. So basically he had regents appointed to him to take care of stuff, and he was crowned, and actually coronated and brought into the public when he was 8 years old. Henry, he was considered a weak king because he was a pacifist. In medieval times, they favored kings that were kind of militaristic and always ready to fight somebody. But he was also known to be naive, injudicious, and sometimes a little paranoid. So France heard about how he was just a weak king, so they sent Joan of Arc, what a woman, with an army to go fight the English because they wanted their crown back. But because Henry VI was obviously more peaceful, didn't like fighting, he decided to make a 5-year peace treaty with France, and that was pending that England gave France Maine, which is not Maine, but Maine, and Henry would marry Margaret of Anjou, and I think she must have been like nobility from France. You would think that after all of this, he would learn his lesson and become more aggressive, but instead of focusing on his duties as a king, he decided to fund colleges and scholars. Henry basically lost all of his French land that his father had won before, except for Calais, and he drove England into bankruptcy and eventually launched the War of the Roses. So in 1453, Henry actually suffered from what people call a bout of insanity, and that lasted for like 17 months, and he didn't understand things that were said to him, and he didn't recognize people during this time. Because of this, Richard, the Duke of York, was appointed to be the protector of the realm and basically acted as king. This led to him claiming the throne. He wanted to be made heir because he was figuring, I'm already acting as king, why don't I just become king? This basically created the different houses, which was House of York and the House of Lancaster, and those were the two fighting sides. So York was the white rose, Lancaster was the red rose, and they were fighting for the crown. So everybody, all the nobility, because this war wasn't a fight with like armies or anything, it was like nobility and whatever people they had, like serfs or whatever they had. Oh my god, where am I getting that knowledge from? But the peasants, whatever, that were living on the feudal lands, they were basically acting as armies in like little itty-bitty battles that they had throughout the course of this, the War of the Roses. But it was basically just a battle between nobility, and people were picking sides and trying to decide should they pick House of York or House of Lancaster to support. And because everybody that's nobility is basically related, so it was a giant battle of picking sides in a family, and that's always a good thing. Back when King Henry VI was still like had his sanity about him, picked a lot of fights with nobility, so that's also another reason why people pick sides and were like, yeah, let's just get rid of him, he's not really an effective king at all. Eventually Henry was overthrown by Richard of York when he defeated Queen Margaret's army and captured the king, because Margaret, the queen, she was more aggressive than Henry. She was a cool lady. She just led people into war. She had no cares. Henry was overthrown. Margaret made a comeback with her army, killed Richard brutally, and freed Henry again to put him back on the throne. But then Richard's son, Edward, got pissed that they killed his father, as one might, and he fought back and took the crown and, therefore got rid of Henry once again. Margaret, Henry, and their son fled to escape prosecution. Henry was eventually captured, and he was then killed while he was imprisoned in a random tower. Margaret, though, she managed to escape and live the rest of her life in France, so she was just chilling. I mean, she wasn't just chilling, but like, she didn't die. Now we move to King Edward IV, which is big because now we're switching from the House of Lancaster to the House of York, which is the result of the War of the Roses. Even though there were still some battles going on, there was bad blood. It was like, civil unrest, even though the change in power. So that's where we are. So after Edward becomes king, he marries Elizabeth Woodville. She's a widower, and she is also a supporter of the Lancaster house, or at least she was. Edward's ally, Warwick, he got real mad at Edward. He was like, bro, what are you doing? Like, she supported the Lancaster house, which is your enemy, so what are you doing marrying her? That's not safe, that's not smart. Edward didn't have it. He was like, whatever, I'm just going to do whatever I want. So that's what he did. And Warwick he planned to overthrow Edward with the help of Edward's brother, George, because he promised George that he would be king if he helped. Margaret from France that had fled, that was previously the queen, she also decided to help. Eventually, though, Edward kind of put a stop to this, and he and his brothers, including George, who pretended to be loyal this entire time, they fought to defeat Warwick. He thought that acting with his brother, even after his betrayal would like basically clear his name. Is like, you know, I'm all good, I'm your brother, like I helped you at least once. But Edward didn't see it that way. He tried George for treason, and George was executed. The rest of Edward's reign was pretty peaceful. He died of disease like typhoid or pneumonia. It's kind of undecided. And he brought back method and order to England after Henry's problematic rule, which was his big thing. Okay, so now we move on to King Edward V. This one's pretty short, pretty sad. His father, King Edward IV, died when he was 12. He couldn't actually rule or take care of anything, so he was appointed an advisor. This advisor was his uncle Richard. So he made all the important decisions and was basically acting as king. Then at some point there was a conflict between the Gloucester and Woodville nobles. This led to the arrest of a lot of Woodvilles, since the king and his brother were Woodvilles via their mother. They were taken to a secure housing place where the king and the prince could be protected. But then that didn't really matter anymore, because the marriage of King Edward IV and Elizabeth was declared invalid, which would make the children illegitimate. So they were removed from the throne, but they were obviously still a threat to power, because what if they just came back? They disappeared mysteriously. A lot of historians actually think that Richard, their advisor, could have murdered them actually, because he stood a lot to gain from the king's death, because there wasn't anybody else that was immediately in line for the throne. So he had already been acting as king, so if the king and the prince died, then he would likely become king. Poor King Edward. Okay, so now we move on to King Richard III. So he was born in 1452, son of Richard III, Duke of York, and Cecily Neville. He became important in society when he was named protector of the realm for the king before him. He married Anne Neville, and that's interesting because that's his niece. So a lot of people accepted him as king, I think, at first. So he was crowned in 1483. It seemed like he had good intentions at first, and he wanted to make peace with some other nobility that had, like the Woodvilles. This couldn't take effect because there were some money issues in place. So he already had a kind of weakened position, especially because he didn't have a super strong claim to the throne in the beginning to start with. So then it's weakened even further when his son and his queen die, because now he doesn't have a queen or an heir. And then there was also some propaganda put out into the public about him being a murderer, which, was probably true. He was also shown to be a tyrant and a committer of incest, but also he married his niece, so he was. So, all of the things that were propaganda against him, they didn't come out of nowhere. But then the Tudors, they come on the scene, and they claim that Richard is illegitimate, and so they make a claim for the crown themselves. Then the Tudors defeated and killed Richard in battle and took the throne, and that marks the end of the White House, the White House, I wish, the White Rose House and the War of Roses in general. So now we move on to King Henry. I believe it's the 7th, VII, but if it's not, I don't really know Roman numerals all that well. King Henry the 7th rises to power after he kills Richard III, so he forcefully takes the crown because he didn't have a super strong claim to it to begin with, so he was basically fight me, and then he won, so then he got to be king. That's how it worked. He was loyal to Lancastrian descent because that's, where he comes from, so he wanted to put the Lancasters back on the throne. He also wanted to end the War of the Roses, the Civil War that had been going on. So he, once he's king, he gets married to Elizabeth of York to unite the two houses. He has 4 kids, Arthur, Margaret, Henry, and Mary. Arthur marries Catherine of Aragon, but Arthur dies like really soon after they get married, before they even have any kids. So Catherine gets remarried to Henry the 8th. Margaret got married to James IV of Scotland, and that united those two countries. King Henry VII was important because he founded the Tudors, and he united a bunch of people that previously were not united and liked to fight, and he just was he was fine. He was a fine king. So now we move on to Henry VIII. So this guy was the biggest man-child ever. Henry was crowned king at 17. So he fought 3 wars with France in 15 years, and he had 6 kids during this time. Only one of those 6 kids survived, and that was Mary I. And Henry VIII really, really, really wanted a son. He didn't want a daughter. He was basically mad at Catherine because she couldn't have a surviving son, because they did have 3 sons, but they all died in infancy. He just was like, I'm divorcing Catherine, that's it, it's her fault. He went to the Catholic Church, and of course they're Catholic, so they're like, nah, dude, what are you talking about? It's till death. That's what this whole marriage thing is about. He was like, you know what? I am king appointed by God. I say that this is annulled. End of story. That's how he got divorced. He just declared it on his own. And then immediately gets remarried to Anne Boleyn. They have a daughter, Elizabeth I. In response to this, Henry says that Mary I is now an illegitimate daughter and has her removed from the line of succession, and names Elizabeth the heir. So then Anne and Henry were going to have another kid, but Anne then had a miscarriage, and that really made Henry angry, because apparently having a stillborn child is all her fault. He tries her for treason, incest, and then she's executed. So then after this, he marries Jane Seymour, and they have a son, Edward. Jane Seymour dies 2 weeks after giving birth, so that's sad for her. Elizabeth was named illegitimate at some point after he had a son. And then he gets married to Anne of Cleves, but the marriage only lasted 2 days before it was annulled. And then he gets married to Catherine Parr, but Catherine Parr was actually a lot younger than him, so she did have like some other guy that she was hanging around, and he got mad, and she was tried for treason and adultery. But in the end, he tried to reconcile with Mary and Elizabeth by restoring their lines of succession. But now we move on to Edward VI, VI. He becomes king at 9 years old and is appointed 2 advisors, his uncle and the Duke of Northumberland, also known as John Dudley. So Dudley, he was the one who really did all the ruling. He and Edward, I should say, they worked together to change England from Catholic to Protestant for their official religion, and they changed Latin masses to English. Mary I and Edward, they fought over religion frequently because Mary was a very Catholic lady. Edward was basically seen as a weak king. He died of tuberculosis at 15, so rip. So now we move on to Lady Jane Grey. Now I feel really, really bad for her because she's basically just a puppet. So in order to understand why she was playing a part in all this, we have to go kind of back to Edward and Dudley. He just wanted to see that his family came into power like officially. This was not necessarily Edward's concern, as you can imagine. The only really big kingly thing that he wanted to make sure of was that England remained Protestant after he died. Dudley basically was going to need a female heir to the throne to get married to his son, Gulliford, and so that they could have an heir together. They would therefore be like a legitimate royalty. But the next queen to be would be Mary. And Mary was, I think, 36 at the time when all this was happening. So they thought Mary was going to be too old, she would never have a kid. And meanwhile, Edward didn't want Mary to be queen either because she was aggressively Catholic. But basically, both of them, for different reasons, didn't want Mary on the throne. Dudley didn't tell Edward what his real reasoning for wanting Mary to not be on the throne to be. So there was this whole big thing. and Edward decided to remove Mary from the line by saying that she was illegitimate. Unfortunately for Edward, he couldn't remove Mary without also removing Elizabeth, even though Elizabeth was Protestant. So he wanted Elizabeth to be queen, but it just didn't work out because she just had to be removed if he was going to remove Mary. So they were like, okay, who else can rule? Who's available? And so the nearest Protestant available to them that would be young enough to have kids would be Lady Jane Grey. Jane is then coronated, but this doesn't go over well with people, and at her coronation, people don't even clap for her because they're like, why is Jane the queen when we have Mary, who's literally the daughter of the king? And Mary, of course, she wanted to be queen, so she was like, I agree with you. So the Dudleys then try to catch Mary before she can try to overthrow Jane and everything, and ultimately get rid of the Dudleys' chances at being part of the heirs, whatever. Mary comes back. I think she had an army or something. She must have. And so she takes Jane prisoner, names her a traitor, and then Jane is executed. She was only queen for 9 days, and she didn't even want to be queen for any of those 9 days. That's so sad. So then Mary the First comes into power after all of this happens and Jane is gone. She's got a mission now. Because now the entire country is Protestant, and she is, like I said, like aggressively, she scares me kind of Catholic. For her entire 5 years on the throne, she just works to reestablish the Catholic Church. And in doing so, she burns 300 Protestants alive, or, beheads them, does whatever. She murders a lot of people. This earns her the title Bloody Mary. And she died 5 years after being on the throne. Alright, so now we move on to the iconic Elizabeth I. So we all know the beginning. Her dad was the worst, and her sister was crazy. So she was really, really smart, and she loved learning, and a lot of people considered her to have a mind equal to a man's, which I guess is, high compliment back in the day. During her reign, she established the Church of England. She also showed importance to things like music and theater, and she supported Shakespeare, as a lot of people know. At some point, Mary, Queen of Scots, tried to take over, tried to take the crown, but Elizabeth was like, no. Elizabeth jailed her for several assassination attempts, and then finally had her executed. Oh well, this is what happens when you try to assassinate people. Life lessons. Elizabeth wasn't married because she never wanted to share or hand over power to a king. She was very much so I want to rule on my own and everything, but it's also suggested and likely that there were some psychological effects that had taken place based on her father just getting rid of all of his other wives. So you can see where she might not believe in love and or trust men. And towards the end of her reign, there were problems like famine, unemployment, and a bad economy, but overall she remained popular with people and remained queen until her death. Finally, we arrive to the end of this little project. Haha. James I, he marks a new House of Stuart, because Elizabeth I didn't have any children, as everybody knows. Technically, this guy, he was already King of Scotland when he became king. He was Mary, Queen of Scots' son, and he made friends with Elizabeth when she was still alive to try to gain political power, and hoped to one day become King of England. He thought that ruling England would be easy because he had already had experience being King of Scotland, and he was like, yeah, I got this, totally, it's fine. But he didn't understand how the politics of Parliament worked and everything, so he clashed with them frequently and subsequently became kind of unpopular. And in 4 years, he doubled the debt that Elizabeth had left him in. Elizabeth reigned for 30, 40 years, and then in 4 years, he doubled the debt that she left him in. That's wild. So then, after getting frustrated with all of these things, He was like, you know what? You know what? I'm king. Let's dissolve Parliament. Who cares? You can't stop me. Nobody liked King James. But you know what? I'll remember him because he's not a Henry, an Edward, or a Richard. So I'll remember him. All right. Well, you've reached the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed. I know I didn't. Goodbye.